Welcome to a new module. We learned the basics and we set up our first project. Additionally, we had a look at how to find and fix errors. Now I want to dive deeper into components and data binding and how you can connect both concepts even closer to now make the next big step in your application. Let's start with an example project. You can find it attached to this in the next lecture, and enhance this project to take advantage of components and data binding to make it a better app. That's the project you can find attached to this lecture here. It allows us to define a server name here and then some content for the server. And then we can either add a server or a blueprint. And as you can see, both look pretty similar, but the server is bold and red or has some bold and red text. The blueprint has some italic blue text. So that's the difference here. Now, this app is all running in one component as of now, in the app component. Here in the template, we got a lot of code and we can do better. We can split this up because that's not ideal having all that logic in this component here. Maybe splitting it up makes sense because that would also allow us, if we build a bigger app, to reuse parts of that. So how could we split this up? We could create a new component for this whole cockpit here, where we enter a name and content and click the buttons. And of course, we could also create a component for an individual server. And with that, we should have a much leaner app component HTML file, and we would bundle our business logic better into individual components. Now we learned how to create new components. I will use the CLI. You could of course also do it manually. And I will create new components with ng-g. And then let's say the first component could be this cockpit here. So I will simply name it cockpit component. Now as an addition, we can type --spec false to make sure this spec, this testing file, is not getting created. I deleted it all the time anyways. And then I will repeat this step for another new component, which I will simply name server element. Server element because it could either be a server or a blueprint in this example. So with that, we got two new folders in our app component. So two new components, thus far nothing you don't know. Now we can of course take our code here from the app component HTML file from this template. So for example, this first bootstrap row here, cut it here and add it to our cockpit like this. Now, of course, if we remove the template part here, we also have to remove, or we have to move the methods we're calling here. So on add server and on add blueprint. So in the TypeScript code here, I will copy both, or I will cut both elements here and move them over to our cockpit. And we will soon also come to ng on init and what this does as a side note. Now, of course, my issue is that I try to push this to arrays or to an array which doesn't exist here. Server elements, that array is still in the app component. We could, of course, move that. Oh, and maybe I should also move that closing curly brace. We could, of course, move this server elements array, but then we would no longer have it in our app component, and we will need it there too, though. Because there, we still will need to replicate these server elements to create the, service we output here. So, as a first step, what I can move, of course, cut and paste, are the two properties which are used here with two-way binding. So I can move that to the cockpit, but we will have to see what we do about this server elements array. For now, let's go back to the app component HTML file and take a single server here. So this panel div here. So with that, all we have here now is the row and the column, and the other part will go into the HTML file of the server element, because that is a single server. Now here, of course, we have this loop, and that's not what I want to have in here, so I will get rid of it there, because I still want to manage my array of server elements in the app component, because we somehow need to be able to manipulate it from the cockpit and then replicate it in the app component to create multiple instances of this server element component, which is only a single server. Keep this in mind, this is not the list of servers. Now, of course, you could set this up differently, but this is the approach I will go with, and this approach won't work right now. We also try to access an element property now inside of our server element component, which we also don't have. So a couple of things to fix. I like the general way we split up our app and that we now can add our app cockpit here, where we before had the full HTML code, we moved over there, and that we can add our app server element component here, and that we could also replicate this with ng4, let server element of server elements. So we can, of course, also place ng4 on a component, as you already learned before. So I like that, but I don't like that the app is broken, and if we have a look at it, that, well, we simply get an error that a couple of properties are unknown. So we somehow, and that is a key part, need to get the new server we add in the cockpit to this array of servers in our app component. So we kind of need to inform our app component that one of its child components, the app cockpit, changed, or that something changed there to which we should react. A new server was added. And then we also need to get the data we got from the cockpit, so this new server, which is managed in this array of servers in the app component, we need to get the individual server of a single loop iteration here down to the app server element. So we need to pass data between components, and that, of course, is a super important task we haven't touched yet, but we will dive deeper into right now. In the last lecture, we split up our app into multiple components, which is great, that is why we use components. But one issue is that we need to pass data between these components. Now, in the basics section, we learned about property and event binding, and there we used it to, for example, bind the disabled property of a HTML element. So we kind of passed data to that element. We passed the information that it should be disabled, that this is set to true, to this HTML element. The same with event binding. When we clicked this HTML button, something happened. This button emitted an event to which we were able to listen. So it sent us some data. The same for the input, where we even used that data with $event, if you remember this. There, we got data from the input element. This is exactly the behavior we need now with our own components. We need to be able to send data into a component or receive data, receive an event. And Angular, of course, gives us great tools to implement this flow. We can use property and event binding not only on HTML elements and their native properties and events, as we did thus far. We can also use it on directives. And we also did this with ng-class and ng-style, there we used property binding. But, and that is important, we can also use it on our own components and bind to our own custom properties and custom events. We can emit our own events. That is what I'll dive into in the next lecture, starting with custom property binding. So we learned that we can use property binding to bind to our own properties of our components. Now this is what I'll start with. So to temporarily prevent my app from crashing, I will simply comment out the code in the cockpit so that this doesn't give us any errors anymore. For now. We won't be able to use it, but it will not crash. Now in the server component, server element component, if we have a look at its TypeScript, at its HTML file, you see that we try to access the element, the single server element. And therefore, we should create a property in this TypeScript file, element, which represents our server. We can even assign a type by adding a colon and then simply defining the type, which will be a JavaScript object, hence the curly braces. And just because it's important, this is not the value, this is TypeScript's syntax for defining the type to make sure that element may only have this type. And we then know that an element will have, well, what we're trying to access here, a type, a name, and a content. So we'll have a type, and type on its own will be of type string. We will then have a name, which will be a string, and we will have a content, which will be a string. So that is all now our type definition for a property we want to use in our HTML code. We use here in all these places. Now still, this element, this property, is part of this component only, of the server element component. We can't access it from outside. Now it would be great if in our app component, where we manage our server or our array of server elements, I should say, if we could somehow access this property. Because let's say, just so that we can see something, we start with one server here, which is of type server, has a name of test server, and a content of just a test. And just to be super clear, these colons here are not type definitions. We're on the right side of the equal sign, so here we are assigning a value, and the value here simply is a JavaScript object, and in JavaScript objects, we simply assign key value pairs, or we create key value pairs by having the key, then the colon, and then the value. So normal JavaScript syntax here. So now we got our server elements array. We're looping through this array here on the app server element, and in the app server element, we have our element property. So a property in that component. Now we want to access this component from outside. So it would be great if we could bind to it, just like we were able to bind to disabled. So maybe add squared brackets, enter the name of the property in between. So the name of the property in the component, here, this name. And then assign the server element. So simply the element we store for each iteration in this variable here. Would be great if we could do this. And if we try this and our app reloads, we see that we get an error that we can't bind to element because it isn't a known property of app server element. Now you might say, that is not true. It is a property of server element. Here, we defined it as a property. It's even public, right? We didn't add private in front of it or anything like that. So why can't we access it? Simple answer, because by default, all properties of components are only accessible inside these components, not from outside. And that generally is a good thing. You don't want to make all your properties bindable from outside. So you have to be explicit about which properties you want to expose to the world, so to say. So if you want to allow parent components to be able to bind to this property, you need to add something to that element property. You need to add a decorator. Remember, I said that decorators are not only available for classes. Here we're going to add one to this property. The decorator we need to add is @input, and here important, you need to execute it. It's like a function in the end, so add parentheses. And input now needs to be imported from @AngularCore. With this in place, now we are successfully exposing this property to the world. So now any parent component, any component hosting our server element component, so implementing it through its selector, like we do here, is now able to bind to element. And I can demonstrate this if we save this. You now see just a test here. You see our component, because now we replicate this component for, well, each element in the array, and we successfully can pass the element, the property, down to that component and bind to the element property in that component. And this is how you can set up custom property binding on your own events, exposing your own properties to the components where you implement these components through the selector.